Let's go ahead and bring in now Dr. Chris Smith. He is the board chairperson of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Chris, thanks for being with us on the Oakland County MegaCast.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Give us a little bit of background to your organization and what you are doing to try to address this issue.
We're a nonprofit, education oriented organization. So fundamentally, we try to provide good, accurate information to inform both the public and policymakers about the nature of gun violence problems, with the idea that in a now time of political polarization, seeking to reduce the number of deaths and injuries from gun violence ought to be a goal we can all share, even if we don't have identical views about the Second Amendment or gun control. So how is it that we can develop dialogue and work together as problem solvers? And of course, we have some big impediments with this issue because of the power of emotion, belief, and political rhetoric, which tends to keep people apart. So it's a challenge, and it's probably a long path, and we don't talk about solutions. We talk about what we can do to reduce the nature of harm and reduce risk.
It is such a hot button political issue, and even Second Amendment supporters, I think you both can agree that it's about trying to curb gun violence. And talk about some of the policies that you're trying to change and why there is so much pushback in trying to get that done.
Well, first, just so we can have a clarification, because sometimes we get divided too much into camps. The Second Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. I've spent 35 years teaching about the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. I support the Second Amendment. My interpretation may be different than somebody else's, but we all ought to be able to focus on what does the Supreme Court say is the legal definition of the Second Amendment, which does provide protection, so that people should not look at any proposal as the beginning of a path to taking away people's guns. We got to get over that hump first, so that we can talk. But I would say there's several things that we know from research that ought to be able to be a focus that we can all be concerned about. When we talk about roughly 40,000 gun deaths a year in the United States, about 2/3 of those are suicides. So if we could focus on, and many, many, many of those are rural suicides of men. That ought to be something that urban, rural, Republican, Democrat should be able to talk about and think about. Is there a way that we can reduce those kinds of numbers? We know from research that domestic violence is a context in which the presence of a firearm statistically increases the likelihood of serious injury or homicide. We ought to be able to focus on that. And we also ought to be able to focus on those accidents that happen every year where firearms are left unsecured in homes. They're accessed by a child who injures him or herself, or injures or kills another child. We all ought to be concerned about that. So there are laws in some other states. There have been some proposals in our legislature, for example, to increase requirements for the way in which you secure a firearm in your home, so that people would be held responsible if they are careless or negligent about leaving a loaded firearm around where a 5-year-old could find it. So that's one kind of policy. some states have emergency risk protection orders, which have been, by some research, shown to have some positive effects. And that is if there is evidence that someone poses a risk to themselves or others, a family member or law enforcement could go to court and seek a temporary order to remove firearms from them. And a lot of these have to do with suicide risks. And people then can get those back, if they're past the moment of crisis, if there's evidence that they're no longer a risk to themselves or others, that opportunity is there. But of course, in the United States, we still don't have universal background checks. And that system then allows people to acquire firearms who shouldn't have firearms. And it seems to me there's broad public opinion sort of support for that among gun owners and non-gun owners. And that's something that we ought to be able to have more agreement about. But this is, very much in a divided political environment. There's some business realities here. If you're a gun manufacturer, there's a finite number of Americans who are going to purchase firearms. How do you keep your sales going, right? And unfortunately, one of the ways you do that is to try to make it easier to buy firearms, to try to encourage people to buy multiple kinds of firearms. And I think also contribute politically to those politicians who see this issue as a way to fan fear and increase division in society. If we could make some breakthroughs here in talking to each other, that might help us with some other issues too.
So one of the things, just to let people know, if you do go into a store to actually purchase a firearm, you do have to go through a federal background check. And but I believe what you're talking about is what some people say is a loophole in the system, and that when you buy a firearm from a private individual, you don't necessarily have to go through that background check, correct?
That's not the same thing. And the other issue with the background check in stores is there's a time limit. So like if the background check isn't completed, and I think it is 3 days, the person automatically gets to get the firearm. So like the young man who went to the black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and joined the Bible study group and then pulled out the gun and killed 9 people, the status of his criminal record should have barred him from purchasing that firearm. But because the system was so slow, and frankly, part of it is slow because there's been politics involved in preventing efficient computerization, he was able to acquire that firearm and commit those horrible murders. So we can improve the existing system as well as try to make it universal. Is that going to prevent someone from getting a gun who's very determined who shouldn't have it? No. But we do see in states with stricter background checks that they do stop lots of people who want to make that immediate purchase. And if we can slow down that process for someone who's in a moment of rage, right, and make it a little longer for them to acquire it, that may not be a bad thing either. Because again, we're not talking about solving the problems of crime, solving the problems of suicide, whatever. We're talking about, are there ways we can improve the system that will save some lives and reduce the number of injuries and fatalities?
We're talking with Dr. Chris Smith, board chairperson of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. The background check is what's referred to as NICS, is the National Instant Criminal Background Check. And so people, just so you know, you go in, you purchase a gun. If you don't, that's ran by the FBI. If you don't get a quick response, then after a certain time limit, you are able to take that gun. But if later it's determined you weren't allowed to have it, then they do contact the ATF to come out and try to recover that gun, which isn't always so easy. So there are so many gray areas into the gun laws within the entire country. It makes it so hard to navigate. And are you concerned because there was a huge increase at the beginning of the pandemic on the number of guns purchased throughout the country. However, the one thing that is hard to get right now is ammunition.
Well, and that I assume is a manufacturing distribution issue. It's not going to be a permanent issue. I mean, I read a report today that 2 million guns were sold in August. I mean, not the beginning of the pandemic, just this month that ended. And that was the 5th highest level of sales in the history of tracking the number of gun purchases. So obviously, if you're in a context where people are being driven by fear, where people think that they ought to be vigilantes and do the job of the police and that sort of thing, it's a recipe for making the problem worse. But there are other kinds of things to think about. For example, my son is a military officer, and he decided he needed to get an AR-15, which was the closest approximation to the M4 that they use in the Army, because he, wanted to go target shooting, and he needed to, stay sharp for periodic testing. He got that weapon within a couple of minutes of going in. The background check was quick. He bought the weapon. And I think the most striking thing to him was there's no evidence or question that he knows how to use the weapon, right? And this is a weapon that has various features and aspects and a higher capacity magazine that could do a lot of harm. Would there be something to be said for, the analogy is the automobile, having a class, like people have to do for concealed carry, having a class, taking a test, demonstrating, safety rules and these sorts of things. I mean, there's other kinds of things that we ought to be able to talk about, but we run into often, beliefs about the Second Amendment that, prevent us from even talking about it.
Dr. Chris Smith with us, the board chairperson for the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. Dr. Smith, moving forward with this, where do we start this conversation about making changes to our systems or modifying the systems that are in place already to make our society safer and prevent gun violence without, of course, limiting the rights of the people?
I was going to ask you, because this is a big problem. Yeah. It's like a lot of issues where people have a lot of beliefs and a lot of divisions. And one of our challenges is to think, can we create contexts in which people might set aside their beliefs and say, let me listen to information. How has the Supreme Court actually defined the Second Amendment? Not what people say they wish it would mean. Because that actually does give us a range of possibilities to have legislation while still permitting people to own firearms with the protected right of the Supreme Court. How do we get people to listen to research about gun violence and to say, wow, in light of that research, perhaps without sacrificing my right, there could be some things that would be done that would reduce to some extent the number of deaths. Unfortunately, we are literally at a moment that seems to make those conversations impossible. I mean, it's almost as if in an election year, especially a presidential election year, especially this presidential election year, one fears we got to get beyond the election and calm things down in order to aspire to have those conversations. And tragically, in many of those states where those conversations finally occur, it's because of the most horrific mass shooting events, which are not representative of gun violence generally, but which strike such a chord of tragedy to people that they then do say, maybe we should do a little more background checks or what have you. We don't want that in Michigan. but that's what's happened sadly in other states that has triggered conversations and action.
Yeah, it seemed like prior to the pandemic, President Trump appeared as if he may have been open to some discussions in this arena and with the NRA and some of the issues that the NRA is having right now. However, it didn't happen. The pandemic did hit. And there is an argument being made that, well, the criminals that are still going to be able to get their hands on the guns because they're not going in and doing the background checks. They're not following the rules that are already laid out. So how are you going to stop from criminals that are using the guns to do so much harm in our communities? How do you stop them because they're not following the rules that are in place as it is?
Well, again, I don't talk about stop because the problem's so massive. I talk about reduce. How do we reduce access? How do we go after that more? And clearly, we're going to have to do some things like increasing the emphasis, increasing the resources of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Explosives. Because unfortunately, politically, that law enforcement agency, as well as the IRS, have often been under attack by people who believe they're a threat to my rights. We should limit the resources they have. We should limit what they're able to do. But when you have these, we have a federal system of this patchwork of state laws. And what that means is there are certain states that are states of origin with lax laws that facilitate gun trafficking networks that we really should apply greater law enforcement attention to. I mean, there was a study once done in New York City, and it was a staggering number of guns that originated in Virginia that ended up in New York City. I mean, there's something to be said for uniformity in national laws as much as we can. But that's a persistent problem that we have to keep going after. But the reality is, the largest number of deaths and injuries is not from that. It is from suicides, and it is from gun violence within families and domestic situations, people who know each other. So there are other pieces of this problem that we ought to go after too. But I don't claim there's a magic wand cure. When you have over 300 million firearms already available, there's no instant stop to that. This is something you have to keep working at to try to bring down the numbers. And the reality that most people don't realize is homicide rates have gone down unbelievably over the course of 3 decades in many places. But the fact that whatever the rate is, it's too high for us as a public. But from a macro perspective, we've had progress on violent crime. And now in the 21st century, we have certain years where we get these ticks up and down. We're in a little uptick year for reasons that we can speculate about. But in fact, compared to going back to the 1980s, we're in much better shape than we are now. It's not because of gun policy, it's because of the confluence of other factors that criminologists have challenges getting their arms around. So yes, you're right. I don't have a cure for keeping people with bad motives from getting firearms. I'd like to work on ways to make it more difficult for them so that you might have certain individuals for whom it is sufficiently hard that the moment passes for them to do what they wanted to do, and perhaps we've saved a life.
Dr. Chris Smith with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. He is the board chairperson of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Dr. Smith, we talked about background checks of particularly of criminal records, but there's not really anything there that provides a background check for any mental health issues. Is that a blind spot that we have in our country in terms of acquiring firearms and in many other cases as well that's contributing significantly to the gun violence issue?
I would worry about the suicide issue in particular there. given the numbers. To me, that's an area that requires greater attention and understanding, because obviously, the word mental health covers a very significant spectrum of things that people deal with, whether it's depression, anxiety, or what have you. I think we need a greater sense of definition of what it is that concerns us. But this is also where a dozen states have gone to these emergency risk protection orders. So when family members see someone in their family who is going into depression, who is talking about suicide, who is engaging in behaviors that raise fear of suicide, or who is in a time of rage about some relationship or some domestic issue, and what they've gone to is to at least have this possibility to go to court and present evidence about this, so a judge can conclude temporarily you need to not have access with firearms while you deal with this issue. I mean, we've had some tragic situations. There was a mass shooting in California a few years ago, University of California, Santa Barbara, and the young man's parents went to the police and said his writings and his behavior indicate he plans to go out and harm people. He has these weapons here. Can't you at least temporarily remove these weapons while we try to get him to accept help? And law enforcement said, we have no legal authority to do that. And he went and did kill people. And, that kind of anecdote has contributed in many states to try to think of this alternative mechanism. I don't know enough about mental health and psychiatric issues to say, how would you define that in a background check? I mean, I'd be concerned of saying, well, someone who's been institutionalized or whatever, because we got medical privacy records, we have people who go into inpatient things for depression. That is a tough area. But my own sense is, numbers wise for risk, that really is a concern about suicide, even as we do see individual people clearly with mental health issues who go out and harm others as well.
You're listening to 89.3 WBLD Orchard Lake, 88.1 WBFH Bloomfield Hills. Dr. Smith, before we let you go, how can people find your organization if they want to learn more about what you are doing or even get involved?
So we have, a website that is just the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence.org. You should be able to find us by Googling gun violence Michigan. We're in a kind of transitional moment because COVID pandemic has sort of prevented having, meetings and, events at the Capitol and that sorts of thing. But, we do have information on there. We're trying to add information that is both informative and thought-provoking and hopefully non-threatening to people's beliefs, so that as we are in this COVID moment, they can read and learn and share things they may learn that's new. But the other reality is, this is all about who's going to be the lawmakers. And we just encourage people to say, assess your views on gun violence and the gun violence problem. Ask questions to political candidates and assess political candidates and include that in the menu of issues that you're concerned about as you seek to vote for people who are interested in this issue and whose views perhaps reflect the same as your own.
The election is just around the corner. Great advice, not just for your topic, but all topics that you are worried about as an individual. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us on the Oakland County MegaCast and sharing this important information.
Thank you for the opportunity.